Welcome to Behind the Bar. It is June the 25th. The prosecution began its closing arguments in the case against Sean Diddy Combs today. It was obviously a hugely important day. We've been talking for weeks now about the fact that all of the evidence gathered in the case has been with an eye towards one event, and that is the closing argument where prosecutors and then the defense will have their opportunity tomorrow will take that evidence and build it into a cohesive whole. In the case of the prosecutors, what they really started out with today was to try to establish that Diddy was guilty of RICO violations, and specifically that he was the leader of a criminal enterprise. Assistant United States Attorney Christy Slavic led the prosecution's efforts in this regard today. She stated that this is the most important issue, that establishing him as the leader of the criminal enterprise is at the heart of their case. She acknowledged that, and that she then went on for the next couple of hours establishing on a piece-by-piece effort to establish why it is that the prosecution believes that he's guilty of the crime of racketeering. She started out by pointing out that the prosecution's obligations, as the judge instructed the jury, and the judge will continue to instruct the jury, the prosecution's obligations are to establish there were two what are called predicate acts. These are illegal acts that serve the basis of the racketeering case against Diddy, form the basis of the criminal enterprise that they allege that he was running. It can be more than two, obviously, but the law requires the prosecution show that he engaged in at least two predicate acts. Those predicate acts can be everything from, and in this case, they specifically point to forced labor of employees, arson, extortion, drug distribution, and sexual crimes as well. All of these, under the law, can be predicate acts for a RICO claim. She then went through a point-by-point recitation or citation to the evidence in the case in an effort to, again, establish these two predicate acts. She started with the allegations of forced labor and abuse of employees, specifically the employee that went by the name Mia in her testimony. And she said that Mia was a victim of forced labor and sexual abuse. Quote, the defendant treated Mia differently than many of the other personal assistants. He demanded more of her, and he abused her. Mia was required to provide sexual services to the defendant. He sexually assaulted Mia when Cassie and his other girlfriends were not around. Obviously, this is all based on specific testimony that was provided in the case. Now, the jury is going to weigh the credibility of those witnesses, but assuming they believe that the witnesses were telling the truth and they give that all the necessary weight to that, what the prosecution is trying to say is based on that testimony, they can establish the elements of a RICO case. The prosecutor said that Mia testified that Diddy had, quote, all the power and control over her. Quote, so even though she never wanted to have sex with him, he knew that she couldn't say no and that she wouldn't say no. This type of what's called forced labor under the law, this abuse of employees, is one of the predicate acts of a RICO claim, and it was the prosecutor's efforts to establish that. Another predicate act, arson. They talked at length about the Kid Cudi car bombing. Now, during testimony, prosecutors acknowledged this. There was no specific testimony linking Diddy to that crime. Nobody testified that Diddy was the person who either threw the Molotov cocktail into the car or even paid somebody to do it. But instead, what prosecutors did was they asked the jury to draw an inference from the testimony they did hear. They did hear testimony that there was a fight between Diddy and Kid Cudi, that Diddy threatened Kid Cudi, and then a few days later, Kid Cudi's car went up in flames. So they asked the jury to draw an inference from that it was in fact Diddy who had either done the car bombing himself or hired or paid somebody to do it. And they said that too is a predicate act. Last, you have two more. You have extortion. This was in the efforts to persuade both Cassie and Jane to continue to have sex with him, or he would reveal publicly videos showing them engaged in these acts. Specifically, remember the one testimony from Cassie where she said that Diddy and she had flown from the UK to New York, and as they're landing in New York, Cassie testified that she told him she did not want to have a freak off. He put a video in front of her of the two of them having sex, and he said, unless you agree to a freak off, I will show this, I will make this public, I will show it to your family and friends. The prosecutors alleged that that was an extortionate effort, and it's a predicate act to the RICO claim. Lastly, drug distribution, and there's lots of evidence of this. A lot of his testimony of his henchmen, his assistants, all of whom are still loyal to Diddy, testified that they did in fact provide copious amounts of drugs to Diddy and the other women that he was sleeping with and the men that were having sex during these freak-offs in an effort to perpetrate the sexual acts. And so the prosecution said this, too, is a predicate act for the RICO claim. The prosecutions did an incredibly effective job. I mean, they really did lay it out piece by piece. We've talked for the last few days, Derek and I have, about how you have all these, if each individual piece of evidence delivered, testified to in the case is a brick, the prosecution's efforts in closing argument is to assemble a wall out of those bricks. And that's what they did in a very methodical way. Moving on beyond RICO, they also, of course, addressed the sexual exploitation the sexual exploitation, the having sex out of control, coercion, a climate of fear. They described how Combs controlled Cassie Ventura's career, her finances, her daily life by making her dependent on him. They said, quote, he controlled her career, her appearance, and how she spent her time. He created a climate of fear that can't be isolated to one moment in time. Cassie did not have the freedom to make voluntary adult choices. This is critical because the entire prosecution's case, as a result to the sexual exploitation and sexual assault, is based upon the fact that Cassie was under his control, that he controlled her in this way. This is the sex trafficking by coercion. They also talked at length, obviously, about the organization of the freak-offs. The prosecution detailed how Diddy arranged and paid for male escorts to travel for hotel nights with both Jane and Cassie, personally organizing logistics and payments. And hold on, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with you guys in just a minute. So as we're talking about the sex trafficking claim, you know, there really was detailed testimony of the lurid acts, the sex acts. They talked about how Diddy orchestrated and paid for the various escorts to travel to various cities, including the Turks and Caicos, New York City, and other places in order to have sex with the various women, mostly Cassie, but also others as well, Jane as well. Quote, when they were talking about and I'm sorry. Then they talked about how Diddy worked hand in hand with his assistant, Christina Quorum, and this is important, to facilitate these arrangements, and that Christina's job was to ensure that Diddy had cash and access to escorts. Quote, she knew exactly what was happening and made sure the defendant had everything he needed. This is critical because one person alone cannot engage in a RICO conspiracy. He had to have done it in coordination with others, Christina Quorum being the most prominent person. There were loads of his henchmen, his right-hand men that he had also worked with to provide the drugs, for example, and to otherwise secure the hotel rooms and the escorts. But Christina Quorum is the center of this because it was primarily her that worked hand in hand with Diddy to commit these unlawful acts. Christina Slavic for the prosecution made clear that he did not act alone over and over again. Quote, just like with everything else, he did not do it alone. He needed help getting drugs for the freak-offs, getting cash to pay the escorts, and he needed help to keep Cassie and Jane in line. For those things, he again turned to his most loyal lieutenants. Going to that lieutenant point, they pointed out that Diddy, according to many people's testimony, Diddy insisted that he be referred to as king by many of his employees, and then he referred to them as his loyal lieutenants. Just like the government is trying to, in the mob cases, would have to establish a full criminal network. That's exactly what they're trying to do here in order to establish that he was engaged in a RICO conspiracy. They talked about how he used drugs and psychological manipulation. Drugs were used to control Ventura, according to prosecutors, and compel her to participate in the freak-offs. The prosecution dismissed the defense's suggestion that Cassie's explicit messages signaled any kind of consent. Quote, she knew that when he was happy, she was safe. And that is critical because there's a lot been made about the defense's assertions that because there are certainly text messages where she appeared to willingly engage in these freak-offs. They're saying that despite those assertions, she nevertheless felt unsafe if she didn't say yes, that her career was threatened, that her life was threatened, that her reputation was threatened as well because he threatened to leak these videos. And they call this a pattern of non-consent. Even when Cassie said no, she was forced to comply. Quote, if the defendant wanted a freak off, it was going to happen. It all comes down to this. What choice did Cassie have in the end? So and then of course the last crime, the Mann Act crime that he's accused of, which is bringing people across state lines, bringing escorts across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. The prosecution did not spend a lot of time on this. This is a really, as we've said all along, a really low bar for them to overcome. Diddy really didn't even put up much of it, is not going to put up much of the defense that he committed acts that are outlawed by the Mann Act. But as we've talked about, the jail time for such a crime is really much, much lower. You probably get away with time served. That's all he's convicted on. So the prosecution did not spend a lot of time with that. It was more about RICO, which he could face theoretically up to life in prison, but it would at least be 10 years in prison. And then the sexual exploitation claims as well, which could be a hefty prison sentence. Tomorrow, Diddy's lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, will have his turn. He'll present the defense's closing argument, followed by the government's rebuttal, if there is any. And then what will happen is likely not tomorrow. I'm guessing that this is going to happen on Monday, potentially, that the judge will charge the jury. We'll read the jury instructions. We'll give them instructions exactly what they have to do when they go back into the deliberation room. And then by Monday, we expect that the jury will get the case, that they will go into that closed room, just the 12 of them, and they will begin hashing out line by line, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, whether they believe that he should be acquitted or convicted for these crimes. Obviously, we don't know how long the deliberation will take. Most sort of the betting odds are likely by Wednesday, prior to the 4th of July holiday, we will have a verdict, but there's absolutely no guarantee of this. Many, many deliberations can go on a week or more, especially when you're dealing with the quantity and type of evidence that we're dealing with here. All right, guys, let me take a couple questions. So Wilfredo Fernandez asked this very question: when will the case be over? Will it be over by the July 4th holiday? Again, we think so, but it could easily slip past the weekend and into the following week. J.O.Say says, why aren't the employees indicted? These are called unindicted co-conspirators, maybe a term people are familiar with. There are finite resources that the government has to bring these kinds of cases, and a couple of reasons. Number one, they wanted many of these employees to testify for the prosecution. And in fact, the prosecution not only didn't indict these people, but they actually gave them immunity in exchange for their testimony against Diddy. Clearly, Diddy is the kingpin of this entire thing. I'm a little surprised that Christina Quorum didn't actually get indicted, and she may actually be indicted after this case is over. That's possible. I'm sure she is very aware of that potential threat. But they wanted to go after the kingpin, and they wanted to turn his henchmen against him, and they did that quite effectively. SAS 1000 says, do you think Diddy had any say in the defense resting their case? It seems odd that it paid millions for a dream team of lawyers only for them to rest the case so quickly. So this references the fact that they did not call any witnesses. Look, the way it would have worked is Mark Agnifilo is a phenomenal defense lawyer, and they would have tried to talk Diddy into following their strategy. That said, Diddy has the absolute right to conduct this defense any way he wants. He could have taken the stand. He could have insisted that certain witnesses be called. But I think Mark Agnifilo realized that by calling any witnesses, you open them up to cross-examination, and you just can't control what's going to come out. The one way they could control what the defense testimony was to put up no testimony at all. But I don't think you should look at that as a sign of weakness. I mean, there are many, many cases the defense does not put up defense witnesses, and they can prevail on that. Their only job is to poke holes in what the prosecution has argued and create reasonable doubt. Purple Yellow says, what was the shared goal and objective of the enterprise? The shared goal and objective of the enterprise was to engage in unlawful sexual conduct with escorts. And everything, all the arson, all of the alleged arson, all the bribery, all the extortion, etc., the prosecution says was all in an effort to create this sexual realm of prostitution and freak-offs. Sarah finally says, why aren't the celebrities who are affiliated with Diddy being looked into? Well, I think they are. I think many of them have. But again, I think the purpose of this case here was to go after Diddy, and then we'll see what happens next. If there was any really strong evidence that another celebrity had taken part in the freak-offs and done something unlawful, right? Freak-offs themselves are not illegal. It's the hiring of the escorts that makes it unlawful. And then the use of force, the use of control, etc. But there may just not be any evidence that any of the other celebrities that we've heard rumors about for months, any of these other celebrities engaged in any illegal conduct. All right, guys, thanks very much. We'll be back. Derek and I will be back on probably tomorrow. Yes, we'll be back tomorrow to discuss the defense's closing arguments.